Good morning. Morning. Gartner predicts that by 2020, 50% of the CIOs that don't transform their capabilities will be eliminated from their leadership positions. I can see many of the speakers over the course of the day this morning wanting to do shows of hands. This is really helpful because we're trying to learn our audience. So I would ask you all, any CIOs in this room? All right. How about IT managers? All right. How about software development managers or directors? Cool. Application developers? Operators? No operators. Okay. Okay, good. That's helpful. All of you are sort of caught in the vortex of this digital transformation, DevOps that we're calling. And to all of you, I posit that we have a few things in common. Your world is not green. Much of it is brown. Maybe even some of it is scorched. You have one of everything, and the technology that you're learning about and hearing about and perhaps even trying doesn't really match with reality. Maybe you've had pockets of success in certain places, but it's hard to make it pervasive across the organization. The complication is that day-to-day integration between the old and the new is challenging, the seams. And you have competitive pressure on one hand, you've got compliance and regulation on the other. So balancing those different requirements can be difficult. And one of the things that we've struggled with a lot is measuring the ROI of your engineering investments. That can be hard as well. And finally, the implications of all of this to your job, to your organization, to your survival even, is that you've got to constantly be demonstrating productivity gains. Does this sound right? Yeah? Okay. And if you don't relate to any of this, let us say you're a cool cloud-native startup that was started in the last 3 years or so, and you don't really understand this messy handoff between dev and ops, then it's been nice knowing you. If you leave the room, I won't be upset. I mean, the whole focus of this talk is to be able to relate to that pain that we've all gone through over the last few decades, and to sort of see what the transitions will look like. Great. With that introduction, I'm off to the races. My thesis today is that container technology enables organizations to be more agile than is possible using traditional infrastructure. Let me say that one more time. Container technology enables an organization to be more agile than a traditional infrastructure-based technology. Now, what we'll do today is basically we will observe the technology aspects as well as the behavioral aspects of what it is like to use traditional technology, what happens or changes with the advent of containers and the container ecosystem, and what we can take away from that. Now, I am going to be using these terms a little interchangeably. I'm sort of making the leap from practicing DevOps to being agile to the business mission of delivering great customer value and also making money. So I'm sort of using them interchangeably, but I promise that I will make some connections as we go along. But before we get into the topic, I want to tell you a little bit about why me and what about me makes this so close to home. I have a pretty cool job at Puppet. It has a few facets, and the core objective of my team is to drive operational excellence in my organization. It has a few areas. One, growing healthy teams, from hiring diverse talent to making sure that the teams have the right composition across a geographically distributed workforce, to making sure they have the right playbooks and charters, and what they're doing in their team level connects back to the company mission. My team focuses on that. We're continually examining how we ship and deliver software. I've got some war wounds, perhaps many of you do, transitioning teams from Dev, Scrum, Fall, Ban to Agile. I'm also responsible for making sure that we are taking the rest of the company on the journey. It is not just enough if your teams are great at iterating on software. You've got to have collaboration as well as processes to go along and make sure that your marketing teams, your business system teams, your customer support teams are all able to actually deliver great products to market. So that's another part of the job. And then finally, I am the chief of staff to the chief product officer. As a product company, it only makes sense that there's someone who's also trying to make sure that his ideas and initiatives are scaling across the organization. As to why, what in my career actually brings me along on this journey, I've spent over the last 20 years or so in enterprise and consumer software engineering across a variety of industries, tools, technology stacks, roles. One of the things that I'm really passionate about is the intersection between things. Of interest to me today is the intersection between software development and organizational behavior. So we'll do a lot of that interconnectivity as well. And as to why Puppet, in case you're not aware, Puppet has been around for about 10 years. It's a company that's large enough and has enough brownfield infrastructure and has a passion to try out its own software on its own infrastructure. And we are on this journey ourselves to move from that brownfield over to more containerized applications. And so I'm here to share my experiences with you. All right. So with that, what is DevOps? The gal who went before me talked about it a little bit, and I'm sure you've all already started on this journey. The State of DevOps Report 2017 basically calls out that DevOps is a loose collection of practices and cultural values that enable software teams across any type of organization, size, industry, to be able to get better software release cycles, better quality, better security, and fast feedback on their development. Now, while we're at it, I'll also go into what DevOps is not. It's not a complex outside-in framework. It is not a product. It is not something that's merely accomplished by reorging developers and operators into the same team. It is not a fad that has come and will pass. And it's not a destination, but it's a journey. And I'll make one plug today, I promise, the only plug I'll make. The State of DevOps report, in case you haven't read it, is an excellent report that's been publishing for the last 6 years or so. The 2017 report has some gold nuggets in there. It talks about how automation and transformative leadership and lean product management can enable your organizations to get to better performance. So if you haven't read them, read them. And the 2018 report as well is actually, the survey is open currently and closes next week. So we would love to hear from you. In terms of why companies are moving on to DevOps, we've heard a lot about it. Even folks talked about it earlier today as well. I won't go into necessarily the business benefits for the business or the developer or the operator, other than to call out one thing on the slide, which is that the incentives for each of these constituents is different. So as leaders who are trying to drive this transformation in your companies, it is important for you to be able to actually address all of these incentives in parallel. Make sense? All right, let's transition then into being agile in a traditional infrastructure world. First of all, let me step back and define what traditional software delivery workflow looks like. Primarily, you have two different teams who are responsible for different portions of the stack. You've got an operations team that is responsible for the operating system. You've got a development team that is responsible for the application artifacts. The development team does its work, defines the features and capabilities, and it hands off those artifacts and the dependencies over to the operations team using some standard packaging constructs like RPMs. The operations team then deploys based on some blessed images that are following company policy and adds on additional things like logging and monitoring and pushes that image out into production. Developers work on more features, and they continue to make this transition happen and hand over those capabilities over. And the ops team will deploy those changes in addition to deploying changes like patches for like OS vulnerabilities and things like that. Now, what it means to be agile in this world, many companies, including yourselves, I'm sure, have started to deploy a few practices to help you to be more agile. One, the concept of using infrastructure as code. In other words, describing your infrastructure itself as code enables you to have speed and simplicity of deployments. Operators are able to do that. There's a dramatic reduction in risk and failures, right? And then you have consistency across a large fleet, so mistakes are fewer as well. And generally, there's lower cost to your organization because the operators can automate the mundane and start to focus on the high-value work. We've also seen customers and companies deploy the concept of canary deployments, what we used to call in software A/B testing. In hardware, basically trying to deploy to a small fleet of your infrastructure with a lower confidence point, and then being able to see how that goes. And then CI/CD for your infrastructure code itself. Continuous integration and continuous delivery for the code itself, again, gives operators more flexibility at lower risk. And it also gives a lot of operational control to your organization to manage change. Imagine doing a pull request review sitting in your pajamas at home as opposed to trying to do the same in a large change control board meeting, a fancy meeting, right? So to make all of this real, I will also share some of Puppet's experiences. Our flagship product used to ship every 3 months. We then found that our customers were not able to adopt every 3 months. They were adopting at a much slower pace. But that doesn't mean we have to ship every 6 months. With our own leadership support, this was only last year, believe it or not, we transitioned from shipping every 3 months with a pretty fat hardening period to shipping every sprint. It was hard, but it was achievable. And what that did was some really cool things, right? First of all, it gave us that fast feedback. We have a customer zero program, which is basically our SRE team using our software. We've got a professional services organization, which is also able to give us that feedback and tell us how we're doing. So that's awesome, right? What we also got through that, which I'm a huge fan of, is small batches of work. So when you're doing small batches of work, I mean, the gal before was talking about feature flags. Your ability to push things out and get feedback and reduce the risk of the eventual deployment is just amazing. And by the way, in this process, we also started to burn down technical debt. Now, those parts were all good, but the parts that were really challenging for us were around behavior. How do we make commitments and keep commitments? Are we paying lip service to continuous improvement, or are we actually doing it? Those were some things that we found to be pretty challenging in the process of going through our own agile transformation. And one of the biggest ones that we've learned and have actually made some decent progress around is what is our shared understanding in the company around agile? Mindset over practice over tooling. I can confidently say that that's something that we're starting to see across the entire organization. Now, traditional infrastructure, in spite of all of that learning that I just talked about, being agile and everything, is going to only get you so far. Why? Because at the end of the day, pace of iterations are still slow. The choice that leaders such as yourselves and I have are still kind of messy. On one hand, we still have this clunky handoff between developers and operators. We've also tried a different alternative, which is building teams where the development teams have a deep domain expertise in operations. That's also hard to do, right? There continues to be a proliferation of design choices, infrastructure choices. For example, regardless of how hard you try to bring all of your teams with like your Spotify guilds and things like that, we notice that there are silos. So what ends up happening is every team has a bespoke way of doing high availability, for example, or has a bespoke way of doing metrics and data collection or telemetry. So that consistency that you're going for is really hard to find at the end of the day. And infrastructure tends to be tightly coupled, which means that developers are scared of making changes. And that is the antithesis to being agile, right? And finally, the design decisions that engineering teams are making have a pretty big impact on operations teams, but the operations teams can do absolutely nothing about it other than to receive and wait and try to remediate. So now let's explore what the container ecosystem does to this entire landscape. First, what you see on the left-hand side, besides my poor drawing skills, is a traditional virtual machine-based application stack for deploying an application. What you see on the right-hand side is a portable and consistent environment for development, testing, and delivery of the same application. Container technology offers the ability to separate applications from infrastructure, just like VMs did the separation between OS and bare metal. And when we talk about containers, we're not just talking about that immutable artifact that you have put your application into. We're also talking about this thing called an entire ecosystem, right? You've got a scheduler. You can't have all these containers running around. You've got to have a system of actually pulling them all together. You've got container registry, and you've got a host of services and tools. All you got to do is look at the badges of all the folks who are walking around at this conference, right? Lots of different things that make up the container ecosystem. Now, how do containers overcome traditional software limitations? Let's look at this on both angles. First, let's look at it specifically from the context of containers themselves. As one of the other earlier speakers was mentioning, developers can package all of their dependencies into the container itself. Applications are isolated from one another. The runtime environment doesn't really vary across dev, staging, and prod because the same container is being promoted across those environments. Developers gain a new level of independence with respect to the underlying operating system. I remember the times when if I wanted to push a software upgrade, push software features, I would have to wait for the underlying OS upgrade. You no longer have to do that. We're also starting to see a similar deployment workflow across various teams that are operating on containers, even if they're on completely different languages or projects. What does that do? It gives us portability for developers inside the teams. Career development moves, going to work on new software, that type of stuff, as well as it gives operators flexibility to start writing some standard tools. Now, on top of that, when you add the container scheduling capabilities, you end up with more standards. Just yesterday, I was listening to a podcast from Google about observability and how you can improve that in the container ecosystem. You have standards in metrics and data collection. You've got a standardized service restart capability. You've got, it's much easier for operators to take deviant hardware out of commission when they need to. Operators have portability across different hardware and different cloud providers. And if you're using a platform like Kubernetes for container orchestration, which gives you that stability across your development environment, then that gives you abstractions as well for various cloud providers. Now, for the record, I'm not saying you must use Kubernetes. If that's your choice, that's great. If you have a different choice, that's cool as well. So these are all some of the benefits that you get by moving to a containerized ecosystem on the technology front. Now let's look at the organizational implications. Developers are held more accountable. They are more accountable for their design choices, for their software engineering choices. And what does that do? That gives them an opportunity to get faster feedback from their counterparts as well. There is actually a greater separation of concerns between developers and operators. For example, Kubernetes provides an abstract representation of infrastructure to your software developers, and it provides a really great way to describe your application requirements to your operators. So these folks can actually literally start operating across an API boundary. Back in the day when we talked about DevOps, we used to say developers need to have empathy for operational operators and their pain. You don't even need that anymore because you have this interface through which they can interact and there's cooperation rather than having to try to figure these things out in meetings. And finally, the third piece I would mention is that adding new capabilities to existing suite of portfolio of products has historically been very challenging in traditional infrastructure environments. What does that do? It makes developers have to have this tendency of shoving more and more services into one monolith, making the monolith even bigger because they're worried about approval processes inside their organizations. With containers, you end up actually having an ease of provisioning smaller, more contained services, which means what? Your pace of innovation increases. So lots of different operational behavioral changes as well that we see inside the organization. All right, so let's take stock. We've talked about what it's like to develop software in traditional infrastructure and the organizational implications. We've talked about what it's like in the world of containers. Many organizations that are trying to adopt these practices and technologies, it's not FOMO, it's not the fear of missing out like my teenager would say. It is real business impact, right? They're doing this for the sake of actually being able to change something in their business, and that is absolutely, believe it or not, that is absolutely existential. Now, the very fact that you're here means that you're interested in being on that journey. And where you go, of course, is going to depend upon your unique organizational objectives, but I will leave you with a few takeaways. On the technology front, start small. Start with something that's not mission critical. We do have a customer who went straight and wanted to containerize their SAP applications, more power to them, but that's not what I would recommend. Start small. For example, at Puppet, we have this tool called Robbie, which you can log into to go see who are all the new employees who joined your organization. Go containerize that, right? Almost every company has one of those in-house applications. Start small so that you have a chance to learn from that experience. And I might be saying something controversial here, but make your developers learn how to use Kubernetes, but not how to set it up. There's a difference. So the point I'm trying to make is this. If you don't have to run your own hosted Kubernetes in your company, don't do it. It's a huge distraction. If you do, in fact, need to do it, and it's essential for your business practices, whatever they may be, compartmentalize them. Because what I'm trying to drive for is a separation between those who are going to focus on building software versus those who are going to focus on the tools. Believe me, it's a huge distraction, and we have tried to figure out how and where our SRE organization is going to be involved versus where they're not. And if you can afford it and you can use it, then use GKE or a hosted solution like that so that you don't have to worry about that part at all, and you can focus on the actual deployment of applications on top of your Kubernetes environment. And this piece is still it's still emerging, but I would totally recommend that you start to look at opinionated CI/CD tooling for how to deploy into Kubernetes. There are some tools that are out there. The point of this is that back in the day when you were trying to employ CI/CD for your traditional infrastructure, things are still pretty bespoke. How they are in your organization is very different than how they are in mine. However, with the container ecosystem, a lot of standards and patterns are starting to emerge. So I would recommend starting to look at that so you don't have to do that on your own. On the organizational front, make sure that there's leadership alignment. Make sure that your leadership, your business, understand what it is you're trying to do with your transformation journey. Because believe me, I've been on both sides of that. And the difference between having leadership alignment and not having leadership alignment is the difference between action and malaise. This is critical. Make sure that you have that, and if you don't have it, go for the right sponsor and go and persist until you have it. Again, going back to that FOMO point, be realistic. Understand what your organization's capabilities are, what your organization's culture is and appetite is for change, and then set realistic goals. Absolutely, set aggressive goals, but make sure that they're realistic and achievable. Go back to Agile basics. What do I mean by that? Continuous delivery of value. Always be working on the most important thing. And be ruthless about eliminating waste. And this could be in the form of useless meetings. This could be in the form of deprecating old software and letting your customers know. But waste elimination is one thing that actually gets off the table pretty easily because people constantly go after the next shiny new thing. And then I'll add another piece, which has also come as a lesson learned the hard way. Don't underestimate team health. There's a great book called Drive by Daniel Pink, which talks about 3 things that developers need in order to be happy in their, not just developers, anybody in their workplace. Mastery, autonomy, purpose. Their ability to learn new things, their ability to be empowered and autonomized so that they can go and solve problems, and they're being able to be tied back to purpose as to what the larger purpose is. So no sacred cows. If you are constantly looking at how you can improve your team's environment to be able to be successful, then you're going to see great things happen. And finally, I'll leave you with a saying from William Edwards Deming: be learning all the time. According to, I don't know if you know this person, he was a great statistician, professor, quality guru back in the 80s. He was also awarded some great medals by President Reagan. Learning is not compulsory, but neither is survival. Thank you for your time. I will be around in the hallways as well. If you have questions, I'm happy to take them. Yeah, it was fun being here. Thank you for being here.